geography, history, and archaeology. So we will now begin with the Mediterranean Basin. If you can now see the map before you, so you just have to locate the Mediterranean Sea. It's in this area. And then when we talk about the Mediterranean Basin, we're talking about practically this whole place here. But for our purposes, we'll only talk about these three different places: Asia Minor, Greece here, and then you have Italy here, because Rome was the center of the empire at that time. So we'll begin with Asia. So Asia Minor. It's called Asia Minor. What is significant about this place is that it is a peninsula, so it is actually roughly equivalent to the modern Turkey, entered Turkey now, also known as Anatolia. Before it used to, may I remind everyone to just put off your microphone so that there will be no unnecessary noises. And if you want to interfere or intervene, you just have to open it up and speak up. Anyway, so it is also known as Anatolia, land of the east. It is 720 miles or 1,158.73 kilometers in length, and is surrounded by Black Sea in the north, Aegean Sea in the west, and in the south you have the Mediterranean Sea. So the provinces in Asia Minor that are mentioned in the New Testament, for example, in Acts and in 1 Peter, are Cappadocia, Bithynia, Pontus, and Asia. These are provinces actually. The Asia here is westernmost Roman province of the whole Anatolia or Asia Minor. It's different from the continent Asia. Also mentioned in some scriptures, basically is the place of Galatia. I mentioned that earlier yesterday. It's at the center of the peninsula. And of course, the city of Ephesus, which is basically a port on the Aegean Sea. So it basically faces the Aegean Sea and was the capital of the Roman province of Asia. Also, it was also mentioned, or at least located in this area, are the first 7 cities mentioned in the book of Revelation. You can check chapter 1 to 3 of Revelation, and you'll be able to see there the names of these 7 cities. So they are all located basically in this place we call Asia Minor. Okay, so I just want to repeat that this is generally what is Turkey today. So the next one is basically that portion where at that time was referred to as Greece. Nowadays, if you look at the map, this is no longer just Greece, but it's also part of Albania is also there and so on. So that's why the profile of the place is different today. So at that time, this was Greece. So what is famous with this place is the Via Ignatia. It's Ignatian Way. It was a major Roman road linking Italy to Asia. It extends from the western coast of Greece in the Adriatic Sea to the Byzantium Straits in the east. So these were basically main routes at the time where people would go from one place to another. In Macedonia, and you find it in the map at the northern part of the map, it's a key province in the northern Greece. The Ignatian Way passes through the cities of Thessalonica, to which Paul has written to a community that was located there, the Thessalonians, and Philippi. This is different from the Caesarea Philippi in the Gospels. This is Philippi in Greece. So Paul would have traveled along this road on his second missionary journey, as written in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15 to 18. Of course, another famous places in the area is Athens, which was the capital of Greece today, is the capital of Greece today, and of course Corinth. So both of these places were visited by Paul, and they're located in the southern part of Greece, in the province of Achaia. And of course, you know that Corinth is one important place to Paul, because he actually wrote several letters to that place. We only have a copy of 2 letters, but actually, according to his letter, he was able to communicate to the place. Communicate to the place several times. So there are several correspondences between Paul and the community in Corinth. Okay. The next one that we have in the Mediterranean basin is Italy. So the city of Rome was founded in 553 BCE. That's the traditional dating given by scholars. It became the capital of the Roman Empire and also the major center for administration of the empire. So since most of Italy is peninsular, it's just like a bar of an island. The seas around it were essential for transportation to and from Italy, especially during the Roman period. On land, we see the Appian Way, Via Appia, extended across Italy from the Bay of Naples, Sea, up there. It's possible that Paul would have traveled along the Appian Way on his journey to Rome, as expressed and mentioned in Acts chapter 28, 11 to 15. So that's why these places are also important to the scriptures because of, especially in the New Testament times. And this was places where Paul has done. Now, this is basically a map of modern day map of these places that we're talking about. If we just go back, when we talk about the ancient Near East, we were talking about, you have to locate first the Palestine area. So this was the Palestine area. And of course, we go up there to create the Fertile Crescent with what you call this, Assyria, and of course below was Babylon. So there in the top, and then Palestine is in this side. And look at the place now. It's basically identified as here you have Iran, Persia, you have Iraq, you have of course Syria here in the north, and then there's Lebanon on the left side, and then of course you have Israel and Palestine, this area, and then you have Jordan to the right here, so the state of Jordan. So, and now of course the Asia Minor is now Turkey. Then Greece is Greece, but Greece is no longer the bigger area, but only this portion. So Macedonia is already a separate place. Albania is there, and then Bulgaria. So Italy, of course, is still the Italy of yesteryears. So you just basically have those places. So if you look at the maps today, and if you go to these places today, these are how these places are now named. So in general, so it's a little bit different from the map that we have been seeing early on, especially during the New Testament times. Okay, that's as far as geography is concerned. So I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have a visual, at least in our mind, of the places that are being mentioned in the text. So that when you try to imagine those places, you'll be able to know how they look like, where they are located, at least in the map, so that we will know more or less about the place here and there. It enriches our information about these different places that are being mentioned. So we can appreciate the importance of knowing these places here. So the next one that we have is history. When we talk about the history of that is basically expressed or which you can actually read through the whole Bible, basically would run from like 1,000 years or so, or more than 1,000 years, I guess. So the major biblical events that we will talk about here are the events that had happened around the year 1800 BCE to around 100 CE. That means like 100 years after Christ came into our midst. Now, it would be difficult to be comprehensive and, of course, to include all of the details in this one portion of our lesson, So even the whole of our lesson would not be enough to actually cover everything. So we will not be going into so much detail of the events that had happened, especially to the people of God in the last 2,000 years of its history. So only a broad overview is possible, so that at least we will know more or less the whole picture in general, and then the trajectory of the events that had happened. So that you have a grasp basically of the events that had happened that is recounted in the Bible. So we'll take into account major events that are essential to understanding the world of the Bible, so that you will more or less know the timeline and then the important events that are worth mentioning in relation to the text that we have. That's why for this presentation, I will just give you basically a chart of it, but of course along the way you'll be able to see how what do you call this, important the details that are here. So for the presentation, we'll just begin with the major events that had happened in the history of the people of God, and then which books basically would provide us with the details of those, and more or less what are the dating that is assigned to them. On the left side, you have the archaeological periods. You'll be familiar probably with this way of determining the periods at the time, like Middle Bronze Age and so on, and then Neolithic and Paleolithic and so on. So they have a different way of identifying the periods, and then we will look into the archaeological finds in those places that more or less corroborate or give us a hint that the events that had happened in this period are actually proven or have evidences on the basis of these different archaeological finds. So we will begin basically with the story of the ancestral period, starting with Abraham and Sarah. So the whole story about our ancestors, from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, you will find basically in the second half of Genesis chapter 12 to 50. So more or less the period is dated between 2200 to 1550 BCE or BC. So this is considered the Middle Bronze Age in terms of the archaeological period. The proof, the archaeological find that will actually help us more or less ascertain that indeed this group of people, the Hebrew people, existed, or Israel for that matter existed, is actually proven by this Hammurabi's law. Uh, Basically, the Hammurabi Law is one of the earliest and most complete written legal codes. It was proclaimed by the Babylonian king Hammurabi, who reigned from 1792 to 1750 BC. So this code was carved onto a massive finger-shaped black stone stele or pillar that was looted by invaders and finally rediscovered in 1901. So what is contained here? So the Code of Hammurabi here will have its will actually be the contents of this law is somehow related to the laws that the details of the laws that you find in the text of the Old Testament. So this is just indicative to us that maybe the one who wrote our text, for example, in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, may have been knowledgeable about these different legal codes, and they have been appropriated and used by the communities basically at that time. So if you have time, I mean later on, you can actually just look for Hammurabi's laws, and you can probably find more information about it. But of course, this is just to say that by comparison, there is some convergence and agreement with the text of the Hammurabi Code with the legal codes that you find in the text of the that we have, especially in the Pentateuch. Okay, the next period was basically the period of Egypt and Exodus. By the way, the ancestral period is the end of that Genesis 12 to 50. You will find the story of Joseph, one of the children of Jacob, who found his way to Egypt because of slavery, because of the because his brothers were envious of him. So you know the story that he was sold basically to someone in Egypt and eventually became close to the leaders in Egypt, and he was even made part of the what do you call this, the court, the palace court at that time. So that's the reason, that's the link that will give us why, for example, we found the Hebrew people in Egypt. So if you remember the story, at some point there was famine everywhere, and even Jacob and his other sons were experiencing the difficulty of having those famine, and they went to Egypt to actually get some food, and not knowing that they were the one who was in charge was Joseph, which was one of them. But anyway, that was the reason why eventually the Hebrews found themselves in Egypt. They became slaves there, and they became numerous in number. So that created complication. So the dating of this portion of the story is around 1550 to 1200 BCE. And if you want to know the details of the stories of these different events on the Bible, you can just read through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Of course, that would include the exodus of the Hebrew people under the leadership of Moses. So they went out of Egypt at that point. Now, this was the period that is referred to by archaeology as Late Bronze Age 1 and 2. So the archaeological finds that is significant in relation to this time is this Merneptah stele. It's a tower. It's like a pillar where they carve maybe stories or history and so on. And this stele, basically, this one is important because among the artifacts, this is the first one that mentions basically Israel. So it is mentioned in the story or in the history that is carved to this stele, the mention of the name of Israel. So at least you know that that the people of Israel is not a figment of the imagination of the writer. It was really historical. But whether the details of the story is the actual details that what happened is another thing. But the fact that Israel existed is proven by this mention in this Mernet stele. This is how it looks like. So it's just like a big tablet where they wrote the conquest of the kings and so on. So they write the story there, and they were able to do that. In the left side here is basically the text that was written there. So the kings are overthrown, saying, "Solemn, not one holds up his head among the 9 nations of the bow. Wasted is Tehenu, the Hittite land is pacified. Plundered is the Canaan with every evil. Carried off is Ascalon. Seized upon is Gezer. Yeneam is made as a thing not existing." And this is basically what interests us. Israel is desolated, her seed is not. So Palestine has become a defenseless widow for Egypt. All lands are united, they are pacified. Everyone that is turbulent is bound by King Merneptah. So this is basically like a document that tells basically the conquest of this King Merneptah. So this inscription is dated in his 5th year, indicating the presence of Israel in Canaan at that time. Not only so, the background in Palestine described in the description precludes any recent coming to Israelites into the territory. So the inscription is of sufficient import to permit reproduction in part. Basically, this text that we have. So that's the Merneptah stele. So that's one proof that indeed Israel as a people or as a community existed. Now, the next event that had happened, so after they came out of Egypt and went on a journey towards the promised land, you know that the story that it took them 40 years actually it took them 40 years to go to the promised land. But if you look at the map, from Egypt to the promised land, supposedly Canaan, is actually closer when you look at it. But in the map that you will probably see on this traveling through the wilderness, It's actually a winding road going downwards and then going up basically to where Canaan is again. So that's what was happening. Now, the next thing that had happened was their occupation of the promised land. So that's why here, the next event that had happened was the conquest or settlement in the promised land or Canaan at the time. If you notice, it is placed here as conquest slash settlement. The simple reason for that one is because if you the only two sources that we have for the story of the entrance into Palestine was were the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. If you read these two books, they have different perspective to the story. One was presenting is as if Israel was conquering the place, like a powerful community that conquers a place, while the other one tells you that it was just a very peaceful settlement. They just blend in, like enter into the community, like the way squatter colony would start actually. So they just peacefully entered into and settled in it. So even here, we don't know how Israel actually occupied the promised land. Did they come in as a very powerful nation, or they come in as someone who just a small one and then just blended with people and then just grew big in time? So that doesn't happen. So you can read through Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel for this part of the story. So this happened around the year 1200 to 1000 BCE. And of course, archaeological period, we put it at the Iron Age 1. Now, the archaeological find that we have here is an example of a four-room house, which was known to be the kind of room that were created in the settlements that were occupied by the Israelites or the Hebrews and the Israelites at that time. So this is basically how the four-room house would look like. So it's the entrance here is below, and then that's basically the ground floor, and then of course there is a second floor up here. Now, to that, when you enter to the left, you have the mangers and animal stables. That's basically a place like that. So Jesus was born in a place like this one. We don't, but of course the one that is pictured to us in Belen and so on, it's as if like it's an outside thing. But this is how it looks, how it is arranged in a forum house in Israel. So that would be the manger and animal stable, but it could be something that is outside of it. Then that's basically as soon as you enter, you have the open air work court of the house, and then in here up here are places for like sleeping, the upper room, and then for eating and the others. So here it says there was during the story of Jesus was no room for Mary up here in the rooms where people would sleep and so on. So that's why they ended up staying in the stables. So the upper room, huperon, is upper room, and then kataluma is loosened down. So those are the names, the kind of rooms that they have. Maybe this loosened down is just like a place where they relax or something after a heavy day's work. So, but anyway, this is how generally a typical house of Israelite would look like. And you can find a lot of traces of this in the area. That's why that gives them the idea that indeed these people existed and lived in those places at that time. Okay, we move on. So the next thing that had happened when they were already in the promised land. So after the leadership of the judges, they wanted to have a king. So they wanted to organize themselves as a nation and as a kingdom, and they wanted to have a king. And of course, that was the time when, of course, the uh, several kings were anointed, starting with Saul, and then David and Solomon. So you know the story of the in the kingdom of these three kings, the kingdom of Israel was still a united kingdom at the time. So if you want to know the story, you can just read 1 to 2 Samuel, 1 to 2 Kings, 1 to 2 Chronicles. This was basically more or less dated around 1020 to 587 BCE. Notice this time that the end year of this kingdom, because that's precisely the date that is already close to the Babylonian exile. So anyway, if you look at the United Kingdom, not the UK of today, but the United Kingdom of Israel, this is basically how they divided the places according to the different tribes of Israel. So Judah is there, Simeon, Reuben, Ephraim, and so on. So this was how the kingdom of Israel consisted in, and it was really a huge place. It's really very big. So that the kingdom. Of course, basically the story that after some time, if you read the book of Kings, Chronicles, and so on, the succeeding kings after Solomon, that's when actually problems crop up. So instead of having just one kingdom, so it came to a point that someone in the children of Solomon did not agree with one another. So they started dividing themselves. So two kingdoms were created. Then this happened between 922 to 721 BCE. So when the kingdom was divided, so it was divided into two parts. So you have in the north, uh, the northern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom. The capital of the northern kingdom is Israel. So you hear the place, and then the capital of the southern kingdom is Judah. So that was the divided kingdom at that time. So you know the story that eventually the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, and then of course after that they occupied Judah as well. So they extended their what do you call this conquest to Judah, and eventually Babylon became much powerful than Assyrians. So they again conquered Assyrians, dominating the land of Israel. So they were able to also conquer the southern kingdom. So eventually, many of the important people in the community, they were actually taken as prisoners to Babylon, and that's basically the fall of the kingdom of Israel. So and if you want to basically read the story behind them, you can just go to the prophets prophetic books. You'll be able to know much of the story that were there. So when before they were practically destroyed by the Babylonians, Judah became the lone representative of the kingdom of Israel. So of course an important element in the story was the death of Josiah, king of Judah. Josiah is well known because he was the one who initiated the conversion of the community and going back to God, because they realized that the tragedies that have been happening to the once powerful and famous kingdom of Israel were actually brought about by the infidelity of the community to the covenant. So they kept on disobeying God in the process. And the main what do you call this sin of Israel at that time was there when they what do you call this when they turned around and considered and accepted and believe and worshiped other gods other than Yahweh. So Yahweh made them basically realize through their sufferings that He is still the God that they should believe in. So God allowed them to go through these defeats until basically Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. So that's basically the end of the date that I was talking about. So here, what do you call this? Some of the people were brought to Babylon as what do you call this prisoners. So what do we find as proofs here? Of course, we begin with the Syrian king Sennacherib. He was the one who conquered the northern kingdom first. So it's not very. This one is bas relief, but it's not very clear. But at least this indicated that this is a monument. This is an image, basically, of the king of Assyrian at that time. So because it's a long time ago, so you hardly have any trace of the face already. Of course, you can always find some uh, representation of faces of the king in online, so you'll be able to do that. Some bas-reliefs that showing Israel's prisoners were captured at Lachish, like this one, but I think this is already located in a museum, maybe the British Museum. So these walls, they were the ones that are used to actually document the conquest of the kings with regards to the people, I mean the community or the nations that they're able to subdue. So that's what we have. And then you have the Babylonian Chronicle. So the Babylonian would document their stories, their history, and their conquest through this chronicle that is written on slabs of stones. So and sometimes they're in different colors and beautiful colors. But you have to know basically how to read these hieroglyphics that you find here. So, but anyway, here there will be mention about the events that are also mentioned in our Old Testament. So that's generally what happened. So they ended up in the destruction of the temple in 587 BCE. This whole section, this whole time from being a united kingdom to being divided, and of course Judah was left, and then of course the destruction of Jerusalem. This whole period, the people of God were called Israelites. But before this, in the time of when they were during the Exodus and even earlier until the time of Abraham, they were called Hebrews. So it is only in this portion of the history of Israel that they are called Israelites. So, so that at least we realize and we know basically how they are named one after the other. So what happened after that was the Babylonian exile between 586 to 539 BC. So, of course, if you want to read more of the stories about here, you can read again Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, some of the prophets. So, that was what happened. So, when they were exiled in Babylon, so in the beginning there were some what call this difficulty in they were not allowed to practice their religion until it came to a point that the Babylonian was overrun and defeated by the Persians, the ancestors of the Iranians today. So they were defeated by the Persians under the King Cyrus at that time. So the good thing that had happened here, since Babylon already belonged to Persia and to King Cyrus, the Jews, or at least the Israelites in this place, were allowed to practice their worship, their religion. So that's why they were able to more or less start thinking about going back to Israel, I mean to the promised land, to Canaan, and started anew, like rebuild the temple, rebuild the community, and so on. So the archaeological find we have here is this cylinder that contains the law that Cyrus promulgated to allow basically the Jews to practice their religion and eventually to allow them to go back to Canaan or to Judah, to the promised land. So this is how a cylinder would look like. Again, it's a container of of documents where you can write the history and so on, but they are made of these rocks here and there. So, but it's interesting that you could still find so many of this stuff here. So anyway, after that, during this inscription of Darius, Darius the First, they were allowed to return, and of course, when they returned to Judah, they were able to restore the community. And after that, when they were already there, uh, the Battle of Issus happened in 333 BCE, and this was basically the time when Alexander was able to conquer Palestine around the year 333 to 332 BCE. If you have seen the movie Alexander, you can actually see that part of the conquest of Alexander the Great was basically Palestine. So that's the reason why the Greek language was introduced into Palestine. When they were under the Greeks, they have to learn the language and everything, and the language at that time was already Greek. So that's why during the New Testament times, especially with the time of Paul and company, and even even the what do you call this, the evangelists, they were already influenced by the Greeks at that time. So they used the Greek language in writing some portions of the Old Testament and also basically the New Testament text that we have today. So that's why in this area, when uh, uh, this was also the time, basically, that as I've said, Greek language became the lingua franca of the place. So here's a picture of an inscription by King Darius. So here, basically, uh, you can see what do you call this, pictures of carvings of what had happened at that time. If you notice, the people here are like tied in the necks, so they're like captives. So this is how they were depicted in many of these things. So this is basically King Darius of Persia. So what happened next after this uh, is that during this time that the Greek language was already there, and then of course the Jews were scattered all over because that was the effect of the conquest of the land of Israel. So they were scattered, dispersed. That's why it's called diaspora. These are the Jews in the diaspora, the Jews that are dispersed. They are in many places outside of Palestine. And many of them lived in Greek-speaking context or in Greek culture. So they wanted to, many of the succeeding generations could no longer read the Hebrew Bible in the original language. So they had them translated into Greek to be able to make it accessible to so many people. That's why the Septuagint uh, version of the Bible was created around the year 250 BCE. So the what do you call this? You can read the succeeding stories after the return to Judah after their exile within these documents and books that you have here, like Daniel, Ecclesiastes, Sirach, and also Maccabees. Then this happened between 333 to 152 BCE. So the archaeological find that we have is the basically elements that are known to be present when Greeks are present. So like Hellenistic gymnasia, it just means basically Greek gymnasium. So these are like places or school or buildings where they had activities. So the gymnasium was a Greek building originally used for athletic activities, but over time it was also used as a place of study and philosophical discussion. That's why when you use the word gym or gymnasium, normally it is identified with like sports or what do you call this, these exercises and so on. But today, gymnasium can also be used as a term to refer to a place of study and philosophical discussion. So during the Greek period, the Hellenistic period, this gymnasia became highly standardized, both in architecture and function, and continued an important role in a young male's physical and general education. So they became common feature across the world, across the Greek world, and were adopted also and adapted later on by the Romans, because eventually the Romans would put up things like this, buildings like this, in when they were the ones already in power. So eventually evolving into the huge multipurpose complex that was the Roman baths. If you happen, for example, to be in Germany, like in Trier in Germany, you could still see some remnants of these Roman baths there, because during the time of the Roman Empire, that was there was a time when the king had his what do you call this? His center was basically Trier at the time. But what is interesting is the presence of this gymnasium. So if you find places like that, I mean, buildings like that, then it's indicative of the fact that the Greeks actually stayed in those places. Another one is Sistos in Jerusalem. So it's like a covered portico of the gymnasium. Sometimes they would excavate things like this one. So that's the reason why this is archaeology is important in at least corroborating the story that have happened. So another event that had happened that was significant was the profanation of the temple by the Greeks, of course, especially during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So you know that this profanation of the temple was the one that actually gave way to the Maccabean revolt that is basically recounted to us in the book of Maccabees. So if you are familiar with the name Judas Maccabeus, so it is basically named after him because he was the one who led the revolt against the Greeks for desecrating and profaning the temple at that time. So they needed to liberate the temple. So in 164 BCE, that basically happened. Now, the next thing that had happened, at least in that area, was the foundation of the community at Qumran around the year 160, 150 BCE. So before they were not known. Before not, there's not much that we know about this community. But when they were able to discover what is now called as the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the Qumran caves, then of course these places were made known. So these are basically like hills and mountains and rocks and so on. And if you notice those holes, those are basically where they were able to discover these jars, big jars containing documents. And most of them, of course, there were documents written in papyrus, but mostly in parchment. That's why they survived. So I don't know if you know the story about the discovery. There was just one shepherd who was just wanted to rest from the heat of the sun. So he just entered into one of those holes, and of course, that basically started the discovery. And this just happened in the 20th century, in around the year 1940s, in the 1940s. So fairly recent. And there were a lot of discoveries there, and it gave us the idea that during the time of Jesus, there was not only one strand of Judaism. There were several kinds of different groups. In the same way that Christianity today has different sects. So at that time, the Jews, the Judaism at the time of Jesus, were already having several of these sects, Judaism. So the main one was the Rabbinic Judaism, represented basically by the Pharisees, of course, the Sadducees, and then of course we have the Zealots, the more progressive one, the more rebellious one who was fighting against the powers that be at that time. And then, of course, you have the Essenes that occupied this community at Qumran. So they're called the Essenes. So at least that gives us an idea that there was not only one strand of kind of Judaism around that time. Eventually, as probably you realize, that Christianity was basically, in the beginning, was considered one of those different sects of Judaism, because you have to remember that Jesus and the apostles and the early Christians were practically practicing Jewish believers, and they basically followed the tradition of Moses and so on. But eventually, the only thing that made them different from the rest of the Jews was they were the ones who accepted that Jesus was the Messiah that they were expecting to come and to basically save Israel. So that was what happened. Okay, and during the year 150 to 137, this is basically Galilee was already added to the Jewish kingdom under Aristobulus. So you can read that in the 4 books of Maccabees. And then around this time, you can find this different archaeological find, like Mikvaot, this one. It's a bath used for the purpose of ritual immersion in Judaism to achieve a ritual purity. If you remember, some of the people there, if you go to a market and then, of course, touch on the blood and so on, they have to go through these what we call these rituals to be able to participate again in the celebration, in the worship of the community at that time. So that's you can find several of these what we call this located and appearing in these different places. The other one was ossuaries. These are containers of bones of dead people. You're familiar with this James ossuary. For a time, it was mentioned in in some magazines and news portals where you see that James here is known to be a brother of Jesus and so on. So, but anyway, this is basically the container of of bones of people. So hopefully you're happy if they are identified as to whom they belong, but some of the things we don't know exactly. Here we have is an example of the ossuary that belonged to the granddaughter of Miriam, the granddaughter of Caiaphas. So things like that. So these are the containers that are being found in many of the excavations that are there. Another one basically is the stone vessels. So these are vessels from biblical King David's palace, and then the Qumran cups here, and then vessels unearthed in Israel. So they also basically provide a link to the period. So that's why it's interesting to also get to know them. And then, of course, the Temple of Jerusalem. So this is basically how it looked like. Now, I was not able to double check which ones belongs to the first temple and the second temple, because the first temple was the one that was built by Solomon. The other one was the second temple that was rebuilt when they came back from what do you call this? When they came back from the Babylonian exile, they rebuilt the temple again. But we know that the second temple was again destroyed in 70 AD, AD and or CE. So, but since that time, they did not reconstruct the temple anymore. They did not rebuild the temple. So, but then what is left basically, as you will probably saw it on some television or videos, that are what is left of these places are just the walls, and it became a wailing wall for the Jews, at least in the places, because they were lamenting the destruction of this important symbol in their community. So after Galilee being added to the Jewish kingdom under Aristobulus, what happened was Pompey conquers Judea. So that means Rome took over. So the Judea became a Roman province of Syria. So they were under the Roman Empire already at this point. So that's why when you talk about the New Testament times, especially during Jesus' times, we always refer to the culture of this time as Greco-Roman, precisely because of the strong influence of the Greeks before them, and of course the Romans when they made these places already under the Empire of Rome. So that was basically what happened. Now during the New Testament times, we begin basically with Hero the Great ruling under Roman authority. So between 37 to 4 BCE. So, and then the next thing that had happened is that Jesus was born. So according to recent scholarship, they say that Jesus was born not on the year 1, but around the 6 BCE. That means before the Common Era. And then, of course, he was crucified in the year 30. And then, of course, first letter of Paul that he wrote was more or less dated around the year 50s. So then what happened after that was the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. And then after that, there's the fall of Masada in 73, 74, and then the Jamnia Council. These are important dates because, of course, this indicated to us that the separation between Christianity and Judaism became clear around this time. But before that, in Jesus' time, there was no Christianity that we can talk about. There were only Jews. There were only Jews who believed in Jesus Christ, but they were not really separating. But after 70 CE, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, especially the Council of Jamnia, so the Jews basically went on their own way. The traditional Jews who did not accept Jesus, and then the rest of the Jews who accepted Jesus became a different community that became the ancestors of Christianity. So that was basically what happened. So this was already the Roman period when we talk about the archaeological period. So the finds that we have here are basically the synagogues where they would usually gather for the celebration. So here are some examples of them. So it says here that there were 480 synagogues in Jerusalem, and every one of them had a schoolhouse and a house for learning, a schoolhouse for scripture, and a house of learning for Mishnah. For the Jews, if the Christians, aside from the Old Testament, we have our New Testament. The Jews, aside from the Hebrew Bible, they also have like an equivalent to a New Testament. They call them Mishnah. And of course, there are other terms that they have for these different documents that came basically after during the time of Jesus, especially uh, for for this community, for the Jews. Then we have also house churches. You have to remember that the Christianity started with house churches. So they were gathering in big houses where usually the owner has many people around him, part of his household, or a lot of people working for them. So it was easy for a community to begin and then become a little community, a little faith community, and so on. That's the reason why we go back to what we call basic ecclesial community, because precisely that's how Christianity started, to focus on people who live close to one another and then reflect on their faith and act on the basis of the challenges and requirements of the faith. But these are examples of house churches at that time. That's where they started gathering the Christians in a way. So here you have in the left the first century Israelite house, and then you have an ancient home synagogue here up here. And this basically tells us how it all started. When Paul was going about giving missions to different places, he was not just easily going to public places. He would usually get in touch with the Christian communities in those places. And normally they are located in houses, like a house church. So that was basically what happened. Then some early Christian symbols that were seen in some walls or doorposts and so on that survive. If you see writings or write like this, they are indicative of the presence of the Christian. This ichthus here, what call this? The ichthus uh, symbol here, this one, is actually ichthus is a Greek word for fish. So that's why the fish has become a Christian symbol. Sometimes you can still see cars today with that symbol. So that became actually one of the symbols of Christianity. So, but here, what people who are not Christians would not know was that the symbol of the fish was actually the symbol of Christ, because the word for this symbol, which is ichthus, which means fish, would actually each of those letters would represent something about Jesus Christ. That's why, for example, the iota in the beginning stands for Jesus, the chi stands for Christos, the theta stands for Theos, and then the huios would stand for Son, and then the sigma would stand for Soter. That's why this whole fish sign indicates to the believers that this is a symbol of Christ. Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior, literally. Of course, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. So, of course, these are part of the things that they can discover and excavate in many places here and there, which will indicate basically to people the presence of Christians in these different places. Okay, so that's basically what more or less a overview of everything that had happened, at least in biblical times. So of course there are so much details in between, but we cannot cover them. But more or less, this is the trajectory of the incidents that had happened. That is depicted basically in the Bible that we have. And again, before you, we have generally the map of the biblical world at that time. So as a conclusion, I would just like to quote this line from the author, basically, of this article that I used here, Karen J. Wennell. She said at the end, concluding that for any detailed and serious study of the Bible, it is important to have an awareness of the physical setting, the significant events, and material culture relating to the world of the text. So physical setting would be the geography, I mean, and the significant events would be history, and then the material culture will be archaeology. So she said these are important. This knowledge is invaluable as it allows us to gain insights into the way that biblical texts emerged out of a particular historical situation and were shaped by them. So that's generally the conclusion of Karen G. Wenel in relation to this article. That is the basis for this presentation. Okay, so that's end for our lesson 2 on geography, history, and archaeology.